abandoned by his wife in the U.S. He found a buried house, but what was inside broke him. Matteo thought coming to the U.S. would fix what his marriage was breaking. His wife left first. Then she stopped answering his calls. No papers, no money, and suddenly, no one waiting for him anymore. That's where he found the house. Half buried in dirt, forgotten by the city, too cheap to ask questions. Inside, the air was cold and wrong. The walls were scratched, like someone had tried to claw their way out. Under floorboards, Matteo heard something hollow. He dug with his bare hands until he hit metal. A locked door, buried on purpose. And as he stood there shaking, one thought wouldn't leave his head. Why would someone hide a house instead of leaving it behind? Matteo stood in the narrow living room with dirt still caked under his fingernails and the taste of rust thick in the back of his throat. The locked metal door on the floorboard seemed to breathe differently from the rest of the house. As if it held its own patience, he pressed his ear to the warped wood and listened. But there was no sound, only a pressure that made his temples ache. The silence reminded him of the weeks after his wife stopped answering, when every call ended in the same empty click. That he had crossed the border, believing absence could be repaired by proximity and effort, believing love waited if he endured enough. Now the house felt like another border, one that did not care who he was or what he'd lost. Dust drifted in the weak light from the single window, settling on his shoulders like a slow accusation. Matteo stepped back, already knowing that whatever lay beneath the floor was not something meant to be found gently. He searched the rest of the house before touching the door again, as if delaying might change its nature. The kitchen cabinets were empty except for a broken plate, and a child's spoon bent nearly in half that the smell of old moisture clung to the walls. Not rot exactly, but something that had been sealed away too long to die in the bedroom. The mattress had collapsed inward, stained darker at the center where a body once rested too long. Matteo imagined someone lying there listening to footsteps that never came, waiting for a voice that stayed silent. The thought tightened his chest in a way that felt uncomfortably familiar. He told himself the house was just cheap because the city forgot it, because paperwork gets lost like people do. Still, he checked the windows twice, making sure the dirt outside had not shifted while he was inside. Back in the living room, he knelt and ran his fingers along the edge of the hidden door. The metal was cold enough to sting, even to the thin calluses he had earned working odd jobs. There was no handle, only a recessed latch that looked industrial, not residential. As if borrowed from somewhere else, he tried to lift it, then shove it, but it did not move or complain or acknowledge him at all. His reflection warped faintly in the dull surface. A face thinner than it had been a year ago, Matteo. Thought of the way his wife used to touch his jaw and say he worried too much about the future. The future now felt like this moment, trapped and waiting beneath his feet. He wondered how long it had taken someone to bury a door so carefully and why they bothered. The memory of arriving in the U.S. returned without warning. Sharp and unwelcome, he had stood at a bus station with a borrowed phone and an address that led nowhere. His wife finally answered weeks later. Her voice sounded distant, already practicing goodbye. She said things were complicated, that space might help, that he should focus on getting settled. Then the call stopped, and space became a permanent condition. Matteo learned quickly how quiet a city can feel when no one is looking for you. The house had seemed like a solution at first, a place to exist without explanation. Now it felt like another test he had not studied for. He found a crowbar leaning against the back wall, its presence too convenient to be comforting. The metal was worn smooth where hands had gripped it repeatedly, not recently, but not decades ago either. Matteo hesitated, listening again for something beneath the floor, some proof he was not alone. There was nothing, yet the absence felt deliberate, like a held breath. He slid the crowbar into a narrow seam and applied pressure slowly. The door resisted with a stubborn patience that made his arms tremble. For a moment he considered stopping, covering the boards back up, and pretending ignorance was safety. The thought of walking away felt heavier than the risk of staying. When the latch finally gave, it did so without noise, releasing in a way that suggested practice. The door lifted just enough to reveal a dark space below, swallowing the weak light from above. Cold air rose in the opening, carrying a smell of old concrete and something faintly human. To Matteo's stomach tightened, as if he'd missed a step on a staircase. He shone his phone light down and saw a narrow stairwell descending into packed earth walls. The steps were uneven, worn down the center as though many feet had used them carefully. Someone had gone down there often, not in panic, but with intention. Mateo realized the house had not been abandoned as suddenly as he had thought. He sat back on the floor, heart pounding loud enough to feel in his ears. The buried stairwell made the rest of the house feel staged, like a cover story that fooled no one who looked too closely. He wondered who had owned the house before him, and what story they told themselves to sleep at night. The city record said nothing except a name crossed out and a sale price that did not match the labor involved. Mateo thought about how easily lives are reduced to paperwork once no one speaks for them. Imagine his own name someday printed on a form that explained nothing. The idea that someone had planned this hidden space unsettled him more than any sudden violence could. Planning meant time, and time meant choice. As the light from his phone flickered, Mateo stood and faced the open door again. He felt the weight of the day settle into his bones, the long travel, the long waiting, the longer silence from his wife. Descending the stairs felt like admitting the house now owned part of him. Staying above felt like repeating the same disappearance he had already survived once. He placed one foot on the first step and tested it, feeling the grit crumble slightly under his shoe. The darkness below did not move to meet him, which somehow felt worse. Mateo paused, realizing no one knew where he was or what he found. If he went down and did not come back, who would ever ask why this house was buried instead of left behind? Mateo descended slowly, counting each step as if numbers could anchor him to the surface. The walls closed in tighter the further he went, packed or reinforced with old wooden slats that bowed inward under pressure. His phone light revealed handprints pressed into the dirt, some smeared, others sharply defined like frozen gestures. They were placed at shoulder height, as though people had braced themselves while standing still for long periods. The air grew heavier with every breath, damp and tinged with something metallic that reminded him of old coins. He felt an irrational urge to apologize, as if his presence disrupted a routine that had ended badly. The stairwell ended abruptly, opening into a low room that forced him to crouch. Mateo realized whoever built this had not intended comfort, only containment. The room was larger than he expected, extending farther beneath the house than its footprint should allow. Concrete walls replaced the dirt here, poured unevenly, which seemed to suggest a haste rather than care. A single bulb hung from the ceiling, unlit, its cord cut cleanly near the socket. Along one wall stood a narrow table bolted to the floor, its surface scored with deep parallel lines. They were not random scratches, but measured marks, evenly spaced, as if counting days or attempts. Mateo ran his fingers near them without touching. Feeling the intention radiating from the pattern, he imagined someone standing there night after night, carving time into something visible. The thought made his chest tighten with a familiar helplessness. In the far corner, he found a mattress thinner than the one upstairs, stained darker and stiff with age. Beside it sat a plastic bucket and a stack of yellowed newspapers tied with twine. The dates on the papers spanned months, not years, suggesting a defined period rather than endless captivity. Point one headline mentioned a missing person from a neighboring county, the face blurred by moisture. Mateo felt a jolt of recognition that had nothing to do with knowing the victim. It was the realization that someone had followed the news while living beneath it, that someone had known the world continued without them and measured their absence carefully. Mateo thought of his wife's life moving forward while he waited for replies that never came. He sat on the concrete floor, the cold seeping through his jeans, grounding him against panic. The room hummed faintly, not with electricity, but with the pressure being sealed too long. He noticed small holes drilled into the ceiling at irregular intervals, some plugged, others left open. They aligned roughly with the living room above, close enough to hear footsteps if the house were quiet. Mateo imagined lying here listening to strangers walk overhead, unaware of the life beneath them. The cruelty of that design settled into him slowly, heavier than fear. This was not a place built to hide a body, but to store a person. That distinction changed everything. Near the table, he found a notebook wrapped in plastic, miraculously preserved. The handwriting inside was cramped and careful, written by someone conserving space and strength. Most pages were lists of mundane observations, meals delivered, footsteps counted, hours of light. Names appear occasionally, always the same two, written and crossed out repeatedly. Mateo did not recognize them, but the act of erasure felt deeply personal on one page. A sentence stood alone, pressed harder into the paper. Than the rest, IT read that silence was worse than pain because it erased proof of existence. Mateo closed the notebook, feeling as if it had named something he avoided admitting. He stood and paced the room, mapping it with his body, tried to understand its logic. There was no door beyond the stairwell, no hidden exit, no obvious means of escape. The design assumed compliance or exhaustion would do the rest. Mateo wondered what kind of person could maintain a place like this and return to normal life above. The answer unsettled him because it did not require monstrosity. Only indifference. He thought of landlords, officials, neighbors who passed by without asking. Questions. The house above felt suddenly complicit, its walls bearing witness without protest. Mateo felt anger rise, unfamiliar but clarifying. At the base of the table, he noticed something lodged between the bolts. IT was a small ring, bent slightly out of shape, engraved with initials worn nearly smooth. The sight of it triggered a memory of his own wedding band, sold months earlier for rent money. The ring here felt like a promise interrupted rather than broken. He pocketed it, without fully understanding why. An instinctive act of preservation. The room seemed to watch him do it, as if recording another change in custody. Mateo realized. He was no longer just a witness, but a participant. That realization frightened him more than the room itself. He climbed back toward the stairs, the effort heavier now that knowledge weighed on him at the threshold. He paused and looked back, trying to fix every detail in his mind. The notebook, the mattress, the marks on the table all formed a narrative without an ending. Mateo understood then why the house had been buried instead of demolished. Erasing it would have been easier, but erasure leaves questions at surface eventually. Burying it allowed the story to remain intact but unheard. As he closed the door behind him, he felt a responsibility settle where hope used to be. The question was no longer what happened here, but whether he was willing to tell it. Mateo slept poorly that night, the house settling around him with unfamiliar sounds that felt deliberate rather than natural. Every shift of dirt against the exterior walls registered like a breath taken too close to his ear. He lay on the collapsed mattress upstairs, staring at the ceiling where faint stains mapped out a history he could not read. The buried room below seemed to press upward into his thoughts, demanding acknowledgement. He dreamed of counting footsteps that never stopped and woke each time the house creaked, unsure whether he had heard something real. Morning arrived without relief, the gray light offered no sense of reset or safety. Mateo realized rest was no longer possible here, only waiting. That awareness hardened into a quiet resolve he had not felt since leaving home. He spent the day outside, circling the property line as if distance might clarify his thoughts. The yard sloped unevenly, the dirt packed down more firmly near the foundation, evidence of intentional covering. Neighbors passed occasionally, their glances polite but brief, trained by years of minding their own business. Mateo considered asking questions, but sensed how easily curiosity could turn into inconvenience. The house existed in a social blind spot, present but unacknowledged. He wondered how long that invisibility had protected what lay beneath. The city's neglect felt less like oversight and more like a shared decision. Mateo returned inside with a growing certainty that the silence was communal. He pulled the notebook back out, reading more carefully this time, forcing himself to absorb the small details. The writer noted changes in the air, variations in sound, the way footsteps above shifted with different occupants. One entry mentioned laughter once, brief and unfamiliar, followed by weeks of nothing. Another described a voice humming upstairs, careless and off-key, oblivious of being overheard. Mateo imagined how those sounds would have felt, reminders of life continuing without consent. The notebook did not plead for rescue or record escape plans. It documented endurance, as if survival itself were a form of resistance. Mateo felt both humbled and implicated by that restraint. Late in the afternoon, he noticed a car parked across the street longer than necessary. The driver did not get out, did not look directly at the house, but did not leave either. Mateo watched from behind a curtain, the sense of being observed tightening his shoulders. The car eventually drove off without explanation, leaving behind a residue of unease. He told himself it was coincidence, but coincidence felt like a luxury he no longer trusted. The house had taught him that attention often arrives indirectly. He wondered if ownership transferred more than property, if awareness itself was inherited. The thought made him check the locks twice before night fell. That evening, Mateo cooked a simple meal and ate standing up, unable to settle. The house felt smaller now, its rooms defined by what they concealed rather than what they offered. He thought about calling someone, anyone, but could not decide what to say without sounding unhinged. Explaining the buried room would require explaining why he stayed. Explaining his wife would require admitting how easily he had been left behind. Silence once again seemed simpler, though no longer benign. Mateo understood how people could become complicit by choosing quiet over complication. The realization unsettled him more than the discoveries below. He returned to the living room and lifted the floorboards again, drawn back by unfinished understanding. The stairwell exhaled cold air, unchanged, patient. Mateo descended with more confidence this time, anger replacing fear as his guide. He examined the walls again and noticed fresh marks near the handprints, subtle but new. They were shallow, recent enough to catch the light differently. Mateo's pulse quickened as he traced them, realizing they were not from past. Someone had been down here after the house was sold. The idea that the story was not as finished as he believed lodged heavily in his chest. He searched for signs of intrusion, finding nothing moved yet sensing disruption. The notebook lay where he left it, the mattress undisturbed, the air unchanged. Yet the mark suggested awareness, perhaps even warning. Mateo considered the possibility that he was not the first new owner to notice the space. The thought reframed the house as a cycle rather than an anomaly. Ownership might have been a method of control, not transfer. He wondered how many people had stood where he stood and chosen silence. The weight of those imagined decisions pressed down on him. Climbing back upstairs, Mateo locked the floorboards more carefully than before. He sat on the living room floor, back against the wall, listening to the city resume its nighttime rhythm. Cars passed. Distant voices drifted, life carried on above ground. The house remained still, holding its secret with practiced restraint. Mateo felt a shift inside himself, a movement away from mere survival. He understood now that leaving would not free him from what he had seen. The question was no longer whether the house was dangerous. It was whether ignoring it would make him the same as those who built it. Mateo woke before dawn to the sound of the house settling, a low shift that felt closer than the usual creaks. He remained still, counting his breaths, listening for confirmation that the noise had meaning. The silence that followed was heavy, deliberate, the kind that waited for response. He thought of the notebook's author listening for footsteps above, learning patterns that signaled threat or neglect. Now Mateo was the one above, and inversion made his stomach tighten. He rose slowly, moving through the house without turning on lights, unwilling to announce himself. The floorboards felt different under his weight, as if memory altered their resistance. He realized the house was no longer neutral space, but an active participant. At the front window, he saw the street empty except for a trash bin tipped over near the curb. It had not been there the night before. The lid lay a few feet away, placed rather than thrown, suggesting intention over accident. Mateo scanned the neighboring houses, their windows dark, their porches carefully anonymous. He wondered how many of them had seen something once and decided it was not theirs to address. The bin felt like a message left in a language he did not yet understand. He stepped back from the window, aware that being seen looking could matter. The house seemed to tighten around him in response. He spent the morning reviewing the city paperwork he had been given at purchase. The seller was a holding company with a name that meant nothing and led nowhere. Previous owners were listed only by initials, each transfer occurring just before records expired. The pattern suggested deliberate opacity rather than negligence. Mateo felt a familiar frustration rise, the same one he felt navigating immigration forms that promised clarity and delivered confusion. Systems, he had learned, were excellent at protecting themselves. People disappeared quietly when the process required it. The house fit too neatly into that logic to be coincidence. Unable to sit with the information, Mateo left the house and walked toward the nearest municipal building. He told himself he was only gathering information, not accusing anyone of anything. Inside, The air smelled of disinfectant and paper, the comfort of official order. A clerk listened politely as he asked about permits, past complaints, zoning anomalies. Her responses were practiced, careful, offering nothing that could be held on to. She suggested records might have been lost in the data migration years earlier. Mateo recognized the phrase as a door politely closing. He left with pamphlets that addressed everything except his question. On the walk back, he noticed the same car from the previous day parked farther down the block. This time, the engine was off, the windows tinted too dark to read. Mateo slowed his pace, forcing himself not to stare. The car remained still, offering no acknowledgement of his presence. The encounter felt staged, like a reminder rather than a threat. He felt the urge to confront whoever sat inside, to force clarity. Instead, he continued walking, aware that confrontation required leverage he did not have. The car drove away once he reached his door. Inside, Mateo locked up and sat at the kitchen table, his hands shaking despite his effort to stay calm. He realized fear had shifted shape, no longer sharp but pervasive. The house was not just a site of past harm, but a node in an ongoing agreement. Someone, somewhere, preferred it remain undisturbed. Mateo thought of the ring in his pocket, the notebook below, the marks that appeared overnight. Possession now felt less like ownership and more like assignment. He understood why previous owners might have chosen silence over consequence. Understanding did not make the choice easier. That night, Mateo returned to the buried room with the notebook and the ring. He sat on the concrete floor, the cold familiar now, almost grounding. He read the final entries again, noticing something he had overlooked before. The writer stopped abruptly, not with despair, but with a logistical note about footsteps changing above. Not fewer, but different. Mateo realized the captivity had not ended through escape or death, but transition. The house had changed hands while the room remained occupied. The cruelty of that possibility settled into him with quiet finality. As he stood to leave, Mateo felt the house above him in a new way, layered with decisions. He was no longer asking what had happened here. He was asking what role he was expected to play now that he knew. The answer was not written anywhere, but the pressure to choose was unmistakable. Mateo climbed the stairs slowly, aware that doing nothing was itself a decision. The silence upstairs felt thinner, strained. For the first time since arriving, he felt seen rather than abandoned, and that awareness frightened him more than being alone ever had. Mateo stopped answering calls from unknown numbers after the third voicemail arrived without a voice. Each message was nothing but breathing, measured and patient, ending before it could be traced. He told himself it was coincidence, a wrong number looping back through some broken system. Still, he began turning his phone off at night, returning to habits he thought he had left behind at the border. The house absorbed these changes without comment, its silence adapting easily to his caution. He noticed how quickly fear reorganizes routines, how natural it felt to shrink. That familiarity angered him more than the messages themselves. He had not crossed the country to disappear again. He began documenting everything, not out of trust in authorities, but out of refusal to be erased quietly. Dates, times, the car's appearances, the condition of the floorboards, the new marks below. Writing steadied him, gave shape to the anxiety that otherwise spread unchecked. He understood now why the notebook downstairs read the way it did. Documentation was not hope, but proof. Proof that someone existed long enough to notice patterns. Mateo wondered if the previous writer had believed someone like him would come along. The thought felt presumptuous, yet grounding. One afternoon, a knock came at the door, firm but not aggressive. Mateo hesitated longer than politeness allowed, weighing options that all felt inadequate. When he opened it, a man stood on the porch holding a clipboard and wearing a city-issued badge. He introduced himself as Daniel Ruiz. Code enforcement, voice neutral and practiced. He cited a complaint about unpermitted excavation, eyes flicking briefly toward the yard. Mateo felt his pulse quicken, unsure whether the visit was procedural or strategic. He invited Daniel inside, aware that refusal might invite more attention. The house seemed to hold its breath with them. Daniel walked through the rooms with measured steps, making notes without explanation. He did not comment on the damage, the stains, the odd layout. His professionalism felt rehearsed, as if he had done this walk before in another iteration. When they reached the living room, Daniel paused, looking down at the floor. "Old houses settle," he said casually, as if offering reassurance. The comment landed heavier than accusation. Mateo nodded, matching the tone, understanding the test embedded in the remark. Silence stretched between them, thick with implication. Daniel left without requesting access to the basement or the permits he claimed to need to the door. He turned back and advised Mateo to keep the property secure. "Vacant places attract problems," he added, eyes steady. The phrasing struck Mateo as deliberate, almost instructional. After the door closed, the house felt altered, its boundaries redrawn. Mateo realized oversight here did not function like protection. It functioned like containment. The visit clarified more than any threat could have. That night, Mateo dreamed of the buried room filling slowly with water. The marks on the table blurred and disappeared as the level rose. He woke before it reached the notebook, heart racing, mouth dry. The dream left behind a certainty that time was not neutral. Whatever system maintained the house relied on inertia, movement, even small wrist attention, but stillness ensured repetition. Mateo sat on the edge of the bed until dawn, understanding the cost of both choices, to be why morning indecision felt like surrender. He packed a small bag, not to leave, but to prepare for consequence. He copied his notes and hid the originals in a place even he might forget. Returned to buried room, he took photographs, careful to capture context rather than spectacle. The act felt transgressive, like breaking an unspoken contract. He half expected someone to interrupt him, to reclaim the space. N01 came. The absence felt less like permission than a warning. Mateo understood that exposure, once begun, could not be neatly contained. As he sealed the floorboard again, Mateo noticed the house did not resist. There were no new sounds, no sudden shifts, no immediate reprisal. The quiet felt temporary. A pause before response. He stood in the living room, bag at his feet, phone in his hand. He had not yet decided who to call or what to send, only that the story could no longer stay buried without his consent. The house had taught him that survival without witness was another form of disappearance. He wondered how much of himself he was willing to risk to be seen. Mateo sent the first message to a local journalist whose byline he recognized from stories about housing neglect. He kept the language restrained, factual, avoiding words that could be dismissed as emotional exaggeration. He attached only one photograph, enough to provoke curiosity without revealing everything. After pressing send, he felt a strange calm settle over him, the kind that comes after crossing a point of no return. The house remained quiet, offering no immediate response to his defiance. He wondered if silence was strategy or indifference. Either possibility suggested he had been expected to hesitate longer. The realization stiffened his resolve. The reply came the next morning, brief but direct, asking for more information and a meeting. Mateo read it twice, measuring the risk embedded in every word. Agreeing meant inviting another witness into the system he had already disturbed. Refusing meant retreating into the same invisibility that had shaped his arrival here. He chose a public place, a cafe near the bus station, crowded enough to dilute attention. The journalist arrived on time, a woman named Laura Kim, her expression alert but controlled. She listened without interruption as Mateo explained, eyes flicking occasionally to the door. When he finished, she did not ask if he was sure, only how long he thought it had been going on. Laura's questions were precise, grounded in procedure rather than sensation. She asked about ownership records, permits, previous tenants, and any official contact. Mateo answered as carefully as he could, aware that accuracy mattered more than outrage. When he mentioned Daniel's visit, her pen paused for a fraction of a second. She did not comment, but the moment registered. Laura explained the limits of what she could promise, the slow pace of verification. Stories like this required corroboration. She said, patience and luck. Mateo nodded, understanding that truth alone did not guarantee movement. Returning home, he felt exposed, as if the act of speaking had altered his outline. The street looked unchanged, but he noticed how long it took the front door to unlock. Inside, the house greeted him with its familiar stillness, neither welcoming nor hostile. He checked the floorboards immediately, finding them undisturbed. Relief came mixed with disappointment. Part of him had expected escalation. The waiting felt heavier now that others were involved. He realized the house thrived on isolation and delay. Connection, even tentative, disrupted its rhythm. That evening, another voicemail arrived, this time with words that a man's voice advised Mateo to reconsider involving outsiders in private matters. The tone was calm, almost courteous, as if offering professional advice. The message ended with a reminder that property disputes could complicate immigration status. Mateo deleted the voicemail but memorized every inflection. Fear surged, sharp and familiar, but it did not paralyze him. Instead, it clarified the stakes he had already accepted. Silence was no longer neutral. It was leverage used against him. He forwarded the voicemail to Laura without commentary. Minutes later, she replied with a single sentence telling him to keep everything. The brevity felt intentional, a signal rather than reassurance. Mateo understood then that the story had moved beyond his control. That loss frightened him, but it also relieved a burden he had carried alone. The house no longer belonged solely to him. If it ever had, he sat in the living room until night fell, listening for a retaliation that did not come. The absence felt like a recalibration rather than retreat. Near midnight, headlights swept briefly across the front windows, then disappeared. Mateo did not look, refusing to offer reaction as currency. He felt tired in a way that reached deeper than sleep deprivation. Exposure demanded endurance, not confrontation. He returned to the buried room one last time that night, standing at the threshold without descending. The darkness below felt unchanged, but its hold on him had loosened. He understood that the room's power depended on secrecy, not presence. For the first time, the house felt uncertain. As he closed the floorboards, Mateo sensed a shift that was not sound but pressure easing. The house did not resist or protest. It adapted, as it always had. He realized adaptation was its greatest offense. System survived by absorbing disruption until it lost urgency. Mateo knew now that persistence, not revelation, would determine what happened next. He laid down to sleep, knowing rest would be temporary, but necessary. The story was no longer just his to tell, but his role in it remained active. And that knowledge, fragile and costly, felt like the beginning of accountability. The article did not publish immediately, and the delay stretched Mateo's nerves thinner with each passing day. Laura kept him informed in careful increments, mentioning verification steps without offering timelines. Records requests stalled, interviews postponed, sources suddenly unavailable. Mateo recognized a pattern from his own dealings with institutions that promised resolution and delivered postponement. The house mirrored that delay, remaining quiet, almost cooperative, and no new messages arrived. No cars lingered. No officials knocked. The calm felt artificial, like a room held at a temperature that discouraged movement. Mateo understood the waiting itself was meant to exhaust him. He continued his routine anyway, leaving the house daily, varying his paths, speaking to no one unnecessarily at work sites. He kept his head down, blending into the background as he always had. Yet something had changed in him, a subtle refusal to fully disappear. He paid closer attention to names, faces, the way people avoided eye contact when topics grew inconvenient. The world above ground felt newly layered, full of small agreements he had never been invited to sign. He wondered how many people sensed these structures without ever naming them. The buried room had sharpened his vision. Not just as feared, he carried that awareness carefully, knowing it could isolate him further. One evening, Laura called instead of texting, her voice type but controlled. She said the story was moving forward despite resistance, that something had shifted. A former tenant had come forward, anonymously, confirming irregularities without specifics. IT was enough to justify publication, though details would remain cautious. Mateo listened, heart pounding, absorbing the cost of restraint. The truth would surface partially, imperfectly. Shaped by legal survival, he understood then that exposure rarely looked like justice, that IT looked like fracture. That night, Mateo returned home to find the front door unlocked. Nothing appeared disturbed at first glance. The rooms unchanged, the air familiar. He moved slowly, methodically, checking each space without panic to eye-in the living room. The floorboards lay slightly misaligned, a difference only he would notice. The message was clear and almost courteous. Access had been taken, not forced. Mateo felt anger rise. tempered by grim satisfaction. They were reacting now. He did not open the floorboards immediately, refusing to grant the intrusion immediate attention. Instead, he sat at the kitchen table and wrote everything down while memory was fresh. Details mattered, even small ones, especially when the denial was predictable. When he finally checked the buried room, he found nothing removed, nothing added. The notebook remained, the mattress undisturbed, the table marked as before. Only the air felt different, stirred recently, unsettled. Mateo realized the visit had not been about control of the space. The IT had been about reminding him of vulnerability. The article published 2 days later, late in the evening cycle, careful with language but unmistakable in implication. IT described a pattern of neglected properties, concealed violations, and administrative blind spots. The buried room was referenced obliquely. Framed as an allegation under reviewed, Mateo's name did not appear, but his experience shaped every paragraph he read alone in the living room, feeling both seen and erased. The story existed now, but incomplete, vulnerable to correction and dismissal. Still, it could not be fully buried again. That mattered more than validation. By morning, calls returned, this time from unfamiliar journalists and advocacy groups. Laura advised caution, reminding him that attention shifted quickly and consequences lingered. Mateo declined interviews, choosing distance over exposure. He had learned that visibility without protection could be another trap. Outside, a city vehicle parked briefly near the house, then left. The gesture felt performative, a sign of response rather than repair. Mateo watched from a window, understanding the choreography. Acknowledgement did not equal accountability. That evening, Mateo sat in the living room as the house settled around him. The silence felt different now, less absolute, threaded with possibility. He knew the buried room still existed, unchanged by headlines or concern. But it no longer relied solely on forgetting. Someone had chosen to tell its story, however imperfectly. That choice did not dismantle the system, but it marked a refusal to participate quietly. Mateo understood then that resolution might not come in his lifetime. What mattered was that the house had finally been named. Mateo did not leave the house after the article appeared, not out of fear, but because leaving felt like retreating from a responsibility he had already accepted. The days that followed blurred into a quiet vigilance, the kind that reshapes time into long stretches of listening. He noticed how the house responded differently now, less guarded, as if secrecy had been one of its structural supports. The walls still held their stains, the floors their warped memory, but the pressure had shifted. IT was no longer only holding a story. It was reacting to having been spoken about. Mateo understood that places, like people, change when witnesses multiply. That understanding steadied him during the long hours of waiting that followed. The house was no longer alone with its past, and neither was he. 3 days after publication, a letter arrived from the city, formal and neutral in tone. IT acknowledged receipt of concerns, outlined a review process, and promised updates without timelines. Mateo read it carefully, recognizing the language of managed delay. Still, the letter existed, printed and addressed, a tangible admission that something required attention. He placed it beside the notebook from the buried room, aligning two very different forms of record. Point one documented endurance in isolation, the other institutional patience. Together, they mapped the distance between suffering and recognition. Mateo wondered how many lives disappeared in that gap. The call that finally shifted everything came late one evening, from a blocked number. This time, the voice did not threaten or advise. It negotiated. The man spoke about misunderstandings, about past oversights, about mutual interest and resolution. He suggested Mateo consider selling the property, framed as an opportunity to move on. The offer was generous enough to acknowledge risk, careful enough to avoid confession. Mateo listened without interrupting, absorbing the implication beneath the courtesy. When the call ended, he felt an unexpected calm. They were no longer denying the house's significance. They were trying to reclaim it. Mateo declined the offer, not dramatically, but clearly to explain that the house was under review and that any sale would require transparency. There was a pause on the line, long enough to register recalibration. The voice thanked him for his time and disconnected without farewell. Mateo set the phone down and felt the quiet that followed settle differently. IT was not the silence of neglect or intimidation. IT was a silence of an equation recalculated with new variables he understood then. That leverage did not require power, only persistence. That night, Mateo returned to the buried room for the first time since the article ran. He descended slowly, carrying no camera, no notebook, only a flashlight. The air felt unchanged, but his body reacted differently. Less braced, more present, he sat on the concrete floor and let the cold seep into him, grounding rather than punishing. For the first time, he read the notebook from beginning to end without stopping. The entries formed a quiet arc, not despair, but adaptation. The writer learned the rhythms of captivity, the way others learn commutes or seasons. Mateo felt an intimacy that did not belong to ownership, only recognition. At the final page, where the writing stopped abruptly, Mateo noticed something new. Impressed faintly into the paper, almost invisible, were numbers written so lightly they had been overlooked, coordinates, partial but intentional, referencing a location not far from the house. Mateo realized the notebook was not only a record but contingency. The writer had prepared for the possibility of being erased without explanation. That preparation broke something open in Mateo, a grief that was not his, but felt entrusted to him. He understood then that survival sometimes meant planning for disappearance. The realization stayed with him long after he climbed back upstairs. The following week, investigators arrived, not covertly but in marked vehicles. They photographed property, interviewed neighbors, documented the buried room with clinical detachment. Mateo answered questions carefully, offering facts without interpretation. He watched how officials navigated the space, attentive but cautious, aware of scrutiny. The house seemed smaller under their presence, its secrets reduced to evidence. Yet Mateo sensed how easily procedure could flatten meaning. Forms could capture dimensions, but not endurance. He remained nearby, not to supervise, but to bear witness. When the investigation concluded for the day, one of the inspectors lingered. She asked Mateo why he had stayed after discovering the room. The question was not accusatory, only curious. Mateo considered his answer carefully before responding. He said, leaving would not have undone what was built there. He said some things survived because someone refused to look away. The inspector nodded without comment, writing nothing down. Mateo understood that some truths were not transferable, only personal. Weeks passed and outcomes remained uncertain. The house was cited, flagged, discussed in meetings Mateo would never attend. Advocacy groups referenced the article in reports that would circulate slowly. Nothing dramatic happened, and that too felt significant. Systems rarely collapsed. They adjusted, absorbing pressure until it dispersed. Mateo accepted that resolution might be partial, delayed, or symbolic. What mattered was that the story now existed beyond the house. IT had entered the world. Imperfect, but undeniable. Eventually, Mateo received a message from Laura saying the former tenant had agreed to speak off record. They met quietly, without recording devices, without names. The person confirmed the coordinates from a notebook, describing a moment of chance that led to brief freedom. They had escaped not through rescue but through neglect, released accidentally when ownership changed and one noticed they were gone. They left the state, changed names, chose silence as protection. Telling the story now felt safer because someone else had already spoken. Mateo listened, carrying the weight of continuity. After that meeting, Mateo returned home and stood in the living room for a long time. The house felt different again, less charged, more inert. Its power had depended on repetition, on stories ending quietly. Now the cycle had been interrupted, not broken, but marked. Mateo knew the house might one day be demolished or renovated beyond recognition. What mattered was that it would not vanish without trace. Its story had outlived its usefulness as a hiding place. That survival felt like a quiet form of justice. Months later, Mateo packed his belongings to leave. His immigration status had stabilized, his work steady enough to allow choice. He sold the house through a transparent process that required disclosures and inspections. The price reflected truth rather than convenience. As he handed over the keys, he felt no nostalgia, only release. The house no longer needed him to speak for it. Others would carry the record forward. Mateo understood that some roles were temporary by necessity. On his final night there, Mateo walked through each room slowly. He paused over floorboards, now removed, the buried room exposed for assessment. The space looked smaller in full light, less ominous, but no less significant. He left a notebook with the investigators, keeping only copies of his own notes. The ring he returned to the buried room, placing it gently on the table. Some objects belonged to the story, not the teller. He climbed the stairs one last time, feeling lighter with each step. The house was just a house again, stripped of secrecy. As Mateo closed the door behind him, he felt the echo of all the silences that had led him there. Being abandoned had once felt like the end of the story. Instead, it had positioned him to hear one that refused to disappear. He understood now that survival was not always about being saved. Sometimes it was about choosing to remember and to speak. Some stories endured only because someone accepted the cost of telling them. Mateo walked away knowing the house would fade, but its truth would not, and that knowledge, hard-won and incomplete, was enough to carry forward. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to the channel for more stories that refuse to stay buried and choose to be told. Your attention keeps these stories alive.